Vücut, uzun. Body. What part?
How are you? How is your picture thing going?
Trying. Do you want to continue?
Okay. How are you? How is your picture thing going?
Trying.
Okay.
Hello everyone, my name is Isabelle Darcy. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Second Language Studies here at IU. And I wanted to thank Erner for asking me to introduce the plenary speaker today. I was very happy to oblige, and I'm actually honored to be able to say a few words about Professor Kabak. So Dr. Kabak is a professor of English linguistics in the Institute of Modern Languages at the University of Wurzburg in Germany. But before accepting the professorship in Wurzburg, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Constance, also in Germany. And in 2010, he was named a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford, in Great Britain. He obtained his PhD from the University of Delaware in linguistics and cognitive science, and then worked as a postdoctoral researcher in Constance with funding from the German NSF, the DFG. So even though it's actually only the second time we meet, I've heard of Barış Kabak some long time ago, well, not that long ago, but in fact just after I finished my dissertation and after he finished his. We finished in the same year, I found out. Doesn't seem that long ago after all, right? And since then I've been closely following his work because, as it turns out, I keep running into it in almost every aspect of my own research. We share many research interests, and I think over the years we've both looked at similar phenomena with a similar approach, but we actually only met in person for the first time 2 years ago in Stuttgart in 2014 when we were both presenting at a workshop on psycholinguistics and second language phonology. Professor Kabak has already published 40 papers and chapters in various prestigious volumes and journals, such as Second Language Research, Turkic Languages, Lingua, Phonology, Laboratory Phonology, The Linguistic Review, language and cognitive processes or language and speech. And in fact, one of the papers that strongly influenced my work early on was published in 2007 in Language and Speech. He has received funding from the German NSF, the DFG, as well as multiple awards from the Excellence-Based Research Committee at the University of Constance. And most recently, he was also awarded a research grant from the University of Wurzburg to study bilingual grammars. So it's hard to specifically define or label Professor Kabak because his research covers a really wide range of topics, but I think one could say that he's a linguist, that's for sure, and who works as a psycholinguist slash phonologist slash phonetician slash morphologist, maybe to name some of the most important areas. He has worked on the prosody and morphology of Turkish and other agglutinative languages, on the second language acquisition of English sound structures, on linguistic typology, looking at stress systems in many different languages, and on cross-linguistic processing of tonal or stress patterns. And the methods used in this research also range from theoretical argumentation via corpus linguistics to psycholinguistic and neurolinguistics experimentation. And yet we can say that the common theme of this work is directed at understanding the internal structure and the mental representation of phonological systems, with a special emphasis on prosodic systems, and understanding their interfaces with other areas of language, and also understanding the consequences of multilingualism when several of these systems cohabit in one mind. So today he is going to speak about Turkish stress patterns in a talk entitled Refining Turkish Stress as a Multifaceted Phenomenon. It's really a great privilege to have you with us today, so please join me in welcoming Professor Barış Kabak.
For these very, very nice words, beautiful words. It's great to be here. Can everybody hear me? There's a handout for this talk. You guys hear me in the back? Okay. This talk is, I actually was trying not to say the word "so" at the beginning of my talk. I think that's cool. So, the talk is about stress in Turkish, and as the title says, I'm trying to refine it, but also refining the patterns in relation to stress. And as Isabel pointed out, I do different types of research. I'm primarily a phonologist, but I use instrumental methods to understand phonological representations. And stress is really at the interface between morphology and phonology. And also it is crucially in relation to speech processing. So therefore, there's actually a lot to say about stress. I worked on stress for so long. My first paper, actually as a graduate student, ended up being published in phonology, and that seems to be quite influential up until now. I'll mention a few things from that paper. Like I said, the talk is about Turkish stress. The problem with Turkish stress is the issue is that it's not so clear as to what sort of system Turkish has. And because Turkish has a agglutinative morphology, obviously syntax plays a role in word formation, and for that reason stress interacts with other components of grammar. So let's just, I'll skip the objectives and claim the handout is really detailed. You can read it at home. Let's just get to the bottom of the issue. So there is Turkish stress system is an interface stress system, and scholarly work on this began at the beginning of the 1900s. If you look at Lisa's excursus on Turkish stress, it talks about how it was perceived by foreign scholars, for example, Hungarians, who actually first studied Turkish. They thought that Turkish had initial stress. Well, no wonder why, because their native language actually has initial stress. Turkish is generally assumed to have final stress. Also, there are cases where stress appears in non-final position within a word. If you look at the data given to you on page 2, in number 1, you see the emergence of non-final stress due to stems of lexical accents. For example, in a borrowing like Sinema, you have an ultimate stress, or in place names. I'm not going to go into detail here. These are just, it's not comprehensive, they're just some examples. There are also cases where non-final stress emerges because of certain morphemes. For example, if you look at 2B, you find the instrumental or there are other functions of this morpheme so this is one word in 2B, because there's vowel harmony across the whole domain, but stress is not final because the element here that doesn't receive stress is presumably a credit of some sort. There are also morphemes that are locally accented, that is to say, for example, if you look at this progressive morpheme Eeyore, it tends to be stressed on its first syllable, and therefore this is also another instance of lexical stress emerging somewhere in a non-final position in Turkish. There are also cases where adverbs are receive stress on their initial syllable. For example, Masal Erdal mentioned this in his paper in 2009 or 1999, probably I have the year wrong, where you have adverbs receiving stress on its initial syllable. Let's take a look at now cases where we have final stress. These are the ones that are given to you in 4. So every time you add a syllable or a morpheme in this case, stress moves to the right edge of the word. So there's right edge orientation of stress. And this is quite regular. These examples come from CeLCAR, 1983. We worked on this extensively. In number 5 and number 6, what you see here is that in cases where you have 2 accents, and the leftmost one wins, despite the fact that there's right edge orientation of stress. So here we have ascending 5 is Istanbul, which is lexically specified to have non-final stress, penultimate stress, and if you add a suffix, the last suffix that I underlined there has lexical accent. Here, in this case, we have 2 lexical accents, including the leftmost one wins, and therefore we say Istanbul in the left. There are other examples there that you're welcome to read them at home. Let's just talk about now how the final and non-final stress is represented in theories. You could assume a prosodic phonology approach, such as the one that I proposed together with Eileen Vogel. I call this the prosodic phonology approach. Basically, stress is a rightmost. It's assigned to the rightmost syllable within a phonological word, and it's not lexical. But of course, for the cases where you have non-final stress, such as in place names or in borrowing, you have to assume that stress is lexically specified, and in that case, that one is the one that's right. So in this account, basically you build a phonological word, and if there is no lexical accent, stress by default appears on the final syllable. Okay. There are also recently top-down approaches towards final stress, for example, in the works of Kamali and Güneş, where canonical final stress, words with canonical final stress have been claimed to be accentless, as opposed to words with non-final stress, which are claimed to bear a lexical accent. I'll talk more about that a little later. But let's take a look at what I mean by top-down approaches. These approaches consider the fact that information structure as well as syntax plays a role in where exactly a particular word is going to be stressed. If you look at the example that I give you in 7, you've probably seen these examples, similar examples before. This demonstrates the fact that in Turkish, what looks like a word is actually extremely complex. It looks like a sentence. If you translate the word in 7 into English, you would have to use many different words. This tells you that syntax is inside the word in Turkish. Okay, why do I keep saying that this is one word? Well, because vowel harmony applies from the left edge to the right edge. That tells you that this is one phonological word. Okay? But it corresponds to many different function words and other functional projections in other languages. Now, if you look at 8, the typical descriptions of Turkish would say that in 8a, you have, let's just say, presentational focus. You have a negative morpheme that I underlined there, which is known to pre-stress. So you have yorulmuyorlar. Okay, this is one, you could say it that way. But if you have sort of a continuous reading or a contrastive reading, like in AP. They weren't getting tired, they were having fun. You could have stress actually shifting to the right edge. Okay? So, and this has been demonstrated by Lipset and Dinesh. As you can see here, this is the context where the speaker is saying they were not getting tired, they were having fun. You see that what is assumed to be pre-axantia is actually has no effect on stress. Rather, stress is realized at the right edge. Okay? So on the basis of these examples, what the authors suggest here is that Turkish word level stress could actually mirror information structure conditions, pragmatic conditions. Essentially, pragmatic conditions override word level stress in Turkish. And I don't think this is actually specific to Turkish. You can also have cases like that in English. Stress shifts are also common in English, in contrastive contexts. You can, for example, say, I will increase it, not decrease it, for example. It's also possible in English. So I don't think this is specific to Turkish, where other factors override word level stress. Now, the questions that I will try to answer in this talk are given to you at the bottom of page 3. What is the nature of accentual commonness at the word level in Turkish, psycholinguistically and postlinguistically? What are the ramifications of Turkish word level accent, both grammar and beyond? Can answers to these questions shed light on the Turkish emphatic or typology concerning the accentual system of the language? Now, a lot of people have talked about where exactly Turkish belongs with respect to its accentual system using phonetic evidence. And actually, phonetic studies on Turkish started at the beginning of 1980s by ConCALL, and followed by Levy and others, who suggested that X0 fundamental frequency is the most reliable cue in Turkish to indicate accentual commonness within a word. And according to Levy, you see this in figure 2, X0 excursions actually help you to understand the location of stress. So in words with canonical final stress, you see a moderate rise, okay, and almost not visible actually in F0, in fundamental frequency. And in cases where you have lexical accents, because of the negative morpheme here, you expect stress to be on the preceding syllable. You see this rise there, and then fall, a drop in F0. So this is sort of the character of F0s in finally stressed words as opposed to words with non-final stress. There are studies that, in fact, suggest that the X0 excursion is not that prominent in non-final, in words with final accent. So there's a little bit of a debate there. I think more instrumental studies are necessary to understand the exact nature of fundamental frequency in Turkish at the level of the word. If you look at Pika, I think this is Pika. I've never actually had the chance to pronounce this person's name. Pika 2006 looked at differences in F0, intensity, duration, and vowel quality, which are the other parameters for stress in other languages. And she found all of them to be significant, but the differences between stress and unstressed syllables with respect to these other parameters, like duration or intensity, are actually, they're statistically significant, but actually if you think about what effect this has on speech perception, well, probably those are really minute differences that you can ignore, that the human ear cannot pick up. So there aren't really sufficient number of perceptual studies on Turkish stress, except for one that I recently encountered by Zora and others. This is a neurolinguistic study, which I cite on the handout. This is the first perception study so far that manipulated duration, X0, intensity, and spectral emphasis separately. And actually, they find many of these cues to be picked up by Turkish native speakers, including duration. Duration also constitutes an acoustic clue for word stress perception, although its lexical status is debatable because Turkish lost the vowel length distinction, and perhaps that durational difference will not be used for lexical access purposes, but actually listeners are sensitive to these differences. Now, what we have is that on the basis of these phonetics or perceptual studies, we have people theorizing what actually this language does. And I call this typology of confusion or fusion. There's a lot of confusion here, in fact. For example, if you look at Levy, who in fact analyzed these things systematically, looking at F0 intensity and duration, who confirmed Conrad's findings that F0 is the most reliable Q, she uses this piece of evidence to suggest that Turkish is a pitch accent language, not a stress language. Turkish is a pitch accent language because it primarily uses F0. The other cues are not specifically significant or they're not perceptible. And she proposes that in the cases of non-final stress, this is what you see 9 on the right edge. This is a word, sandalie, which has non-final stress. She assumes that there is a lexical pitch accent, H star low, that is aligned with that second syllable, and you get that realization. In cases where you have final stress, the pitch accent is to just H star because the low tone will not have any target. That's why that's good. So basically, for Levy, non-final stress and final stress are the same thing. There's a pitch accent, underlying pitch accent, and you basically align that with the relevant syllable. Now, Güneş, in her dissertation, I was so proud to be actually part of the examination committee, she assumes that non-final stress in Turkish is pitch accent, whereas final stress is stress accent, since the final syllable does not exhibit any F0 excursion, according to her findings. This is another way of thinking about that phonetic evidence. And this is completely the opposite of what Turkic linguists have proposed. They proposed the opposite. For example, Chato and Johansson suggested the opposite. Stress is realized by pitch accent on the final syllable. However, it's realized by stress accent on the non-final syllable. So it looks like people use phonetic evidence in different ways, not with so much justification other than the fact that, well, okay, F0 is the most reliable cue. What do we do with this? Well, if the language exclusively uses F0, it's a pitch accent language. This is the point that I'm going to attack actually in this talk. I will evaluate it on the basis of typological evidence from other languages. Now, what is interesting is that Kamali, in her dissertation, as well as Güneş, they look at words in different sentential contexts. And I would like you to look at figure 4, please. And it's important to actually walk you through these. What you have here is a sentence. You should write those who get overheated to the one that this is from Kamali's dissertation. Where you have a verb in the final position, an object, and a subject here. Okay? And what you have here is that this is the nuclear position. So the nuclear position, this word is supposed to have final stress, but you don't really see that excursion, F0 excursion. There's no rise. Okay? It looks like the word is accent, actually. So you would expect final stress on the final symbol of the word, but there is nothing in it if you just look at the pitch tracks. Now, in this particular sentence, what she did is that she replaced the object now with a word that has lexical stress, non-final stress, pneumonia, which is assumed to be a place name. Place names typically have non-final stress in Turkish. And there, because this is non-final, we see this rise and then fall. Okay? So, on the basis of this art, and also bear in mind that if you look at the pre-clear position, with the subject position, you see this rise at the end. Okay? Because of the basic subject boundary. Right? So sometimes you see this F0 rise, sometimes it's not there. Right? And the other example actually helps us a lot to differentiate between the two now. Now in this case she has in the subject position a word with non-final stress or lexical stress. You see this F0 rise and fall, but then again there is another rise at the edge of the subject pointing out the phrase boundary. So it looks like, in fact, final stress is a phrasal stress in this language. And if you look at the object position in the nuclear accent position, there's no F0 rise in the final syllable. Okay? So on the basis of this evidence, Kamali and Güneş would also agree with that. Turkish finally stressed words are actually accentless words. And accentless words are common, relatively common in other languages such as Basque and in Japanese. These are assumed to be pitch accent languages. And I'll just quote Kamali here. This is almost at the bottom of page 5. Final stress seems to be an epiphenomenon at the word level. The perception of finality is possibly a perceptual elsewhere condition, where in fact there is no tonal marking of the relevant syllable. Finally stressed words in Turkish are accentless words, which are attested in Japanese and a variety of Basque. Now, this is an interesting piece of work and it makes an important suggestion here. However, other parameters such as intensity, duration, a lot of parameters are not being used, and we know from work in other languages that these clues can also be important, especially in non-nuclear positions. So you need actually more systematic phonetic evidence to make these generalizations. So what I'm trying to say is that the phonetic evidence presented so far is limited and misinterpreted. There's no doubt that word final stress arises as a default, so we don't actually need to in any lexical accent whatsoever. It's just the property of the word, and by default, if the word doesn't carry any lexical accent, you would have to have prominence somewhere, and that tends to be the final syllable in Turkish. But claiming that finally stressed words are accentless actually have serious consequences for typology and for psycholinguistics, which I mentioned here on page 6. If Turkish is a pitch accent language, there must be both accented and accentless words in the lexicon. Then the so-called accentless words should behave like accentless words from a typological viewpoint. Since accentless words have no word-level stress, language users should treat such words as such in speech perception and processing. Likewise, if word final stress is epiphenomenal due to some sort of perceptual illusion, we should not see any relevance of it for the phonological system and its penumbra. And assuming that pitch accent and stress accent coexist in the same grammar, I think this is cumbersome. This must also have some consequences for language acquisition. I won't really entertain this possibility, but if you assume that two separate systems coexist in the same language, like the way Güneş assumes, then this must be very good for the child to actually learn this system. Now, in 5, what I'm doing is that I'm giving you different pieces of evidence from languages that are claimed to have accentless words, such as Indonesian. Let's take a look at the case of Indonesian. Here, Indonesian stress is really tricky. And people have different descriptions of this. Foreigners who study Indonesian propose different positions for stress, just like the way Hungarians did with Turkish stress. They impose their own perceptual, their own phonological system onto the Indonesian system. But generally, it is assumed that Indonesian is penultimate stress, but there are disagreements. Halim, 1974, assumes that there is no word-level stress in this language, but there is sentence-based accent, and the exact position of this accent depends on the position of the relevant word in the sentence. The exact description is there; it's not relevant to us, but it's very specific to context. It's very specific to sentential context as to where stress is going to appear in this language. Sometimes it doesn't appear at all. There are perceptual studies, there are psycholinguistic studies on Indonesian speakers. What they show is, for example, Van Zanten and Van Poyven, they show that in word recognition experiments, Indonesian listeners fare no better when presented with a stressed syllable than when presented with an unstressed syllable. So if you have a multisyllabic word, no matter where you put the stress and present these words to Indonesian speakers, they say, well, it's fine. I don't care. If you say, record or report, I don't care what you say. It's the same. So this is a true instance of accentless words. There's no particular position of the word that receives accent by default. If prominence, a strong position is realized, then it depends on where exactly the word is within a sentence. Okay? So, on the basis of this evidence, they suggest that the rule that drives prominence patterns in Indonesian is basically phrasal. There's no word level prominence. Okay? You can also give Korean as an example. For Korean is an interesting language where there's a lot of debate as to where word level stress is. It's not like in Turkish where there's a common agreement. People have proposed different things. According to June, there's no word level stress of phrasing stress, and just like in the case of Indonesian, sentential position as well as other factors govern the exact location of stress. So basically, what we find out from this typological research informed by psycholinguistics is that accentless words, that basically being accents at the word level means that your stress system is unstable, its variable, its position is variable, and its exact position is modulated by other things like sentential position. Now, are there studies that look at stress in Turkish from a psycholinguistic point of view? Yes, there are actually quite a number of studies so far. For example, stress deafness has been observed in French. French is known to have, there's also a debate in French as to whether there's word stress or phrasal stress. It tends to be a very fixed stress system, very much similar to Turkish. There are studies that look at French speakers' perception of stress differences, and basically they are not sensitive to these differences, so which Dukou and others call stress deafness. In her dissertation, Altman looked at different speakers, including Turkish speakers, on their perception of English stress. What you find in figure 6, which I will show on the slide here, is these are perceptual scores, different scores. Of course, the higher the bar is, the better you are in perceiving a difference in the location of stress. What you see here is that speakers of Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and English native speakers both pattern together in perceiving stress correctly. Okay? The position of stress, or detecting a difference in the location of stress. Spanish speakers likewise. Okay? Whereas French, Turkish, and Arabic speakers do poorly, okay, in detecting a difference. Basically, in this experiment, you give people 3 trisyllabic 4-syllable words, and you ask them to sort of indicate where they hear stress. This is actually a metalinguistic task. And you can see that French, Turkish, and Arabic speakers are having difficulty locating the exact location of prominence in these nonsense words that are presumably English words. Now, what you find in this is an impressive number of languages here. Turkish doesn't really pattern with Korean and Japanese that are essentially retract languages. It patterns with French and Arabic. Okay, well, for French, there are types of retract language, but there's no way that you can actually say the same thing about Arabic. Arabic is a stress language. Okay? So on the basis of this cross-linguistic experiment, you could suggest that Turkish actually behaves like a language where stress is regular and fixed, and for that reason, it's not important for the speaker to, in fact, put this in the abstract representation of words, and if you're not doing it, then of course you're not sensitive to stress. Now, what about Chinese? Well, Chinese doesn't have stress either, but there is probably meta-linguistic awareness of tunes and tones, and for that reason, they're doing meta-linguistic processing to actually find out where the prominent syllable is, and you say the same thing for Japanese and Korean. These are not stress languages, they rely on some other cue, some other parameter to locate stress. Okay. Now, there is a neurolinguistic study that I was part of, and in this study, the question that we asked, this is in section 6.2, whether Turkish speakers distinguish between violations of default stress and violations of the non-default stress patterns. Now, according to neurolinguistic experiments, if you have violations, deviations from lexically specified accents, you should have an ERP component that would give you a lexical violation effect, because you're violating a semantic contrast here. Okay? Whereas deviations from regular stress should not yield lexical lexical violation effects, because non-final stress is basically not lexical, as we said. So you should get what's called P300 effects if you're violating regular stress, but if you're violating lexical stress, you should get N400 type of violations. What we did in this experiment is that we showed people on the screen a word like fiasco, which is which is a word in Turkish that is not stressed on the final syllable, but rather on the penultimate syllable. And there was a behavioral task. You see the results of the behavioral task where we asked people to tell us whether they like the word or not. These were real words of Turkish. As you can see, they're doing pretty well with recognizing correctly that a word with finally stressed syllable like baklava, if you say baklava, it should be correct, but if you say baklava or baklava, that should be wrong. Okay. You can see that actually they're doing quite well, although not really 100% level. In cases where a word with canonical penultimate stress like fiasco, if you say fiasco or fiasco, the violation to unpenultimate stress is actually recognized quite good, quite well, but shift to final stress is actually, they're not doing well there. So probably this is because of the fact that there's regularization in the language, that there's so much of a frequency effect that finally words produced with final stress are actually now quite acceptable. Now let's take a look at the ERP components here. You can see that in baklava, I'm not going to go into detail because it's really too technical. What you see is exactly what we predicted, that violations from lexical stress, so saying, so this is another word, the penultimate says teatro. If you say teatro or teatro, what you get is an N400 effect, which is a lexical violation, semantic violation effect. Whereas if you deviate from final stress, so baklava has final stress, if you say baklava or baklava, you don't get that N400 stress. So this suggests that actually words with non-final stress is lexically specified in the lexicon, whereas words with final stress just behave like German stress. In fact, you find same patterns in neurolinguistic studies on German stress violations. You see pretty much the same effect. So there is actually stress at the word level, and this also reflects in neurolinguistic studies. Now, I would like to move to section 7. What I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to refine where Turkish is and what sort of creature this is. And my immediate comparison here is English. English is a well-known stress language. Nobody would claim that he used the pitch accent language. That's why I take English as a reference here. Let's see what English stress does for this language and for the speakers of this language. English has a phonetic effect on, English stress has a phonetic effect on segmental phonology. For example, the flapping rule in general American English is governed by the position of stress. There's vowel reduction in unstressed syllables, so there is an interaction between stress and segmental phonology in this language. The morphology also dictates certain stress properties. There are cases where a particular morpheme cannot be attached to a verb because the verb doesn't have the exact stress configuration. So morphology is sensitive. It's peculiar, actually. It says, well, I don't want stress in this position. So, for example, you can say arrival, but entro is not possible in English because the word, the root actually doesn't follow the stress requirement. Stress interacts with morphology in dialect of American English. For example, a prefix is sensitive to the stress position of the word. There's expletive infixation in English that is highly sensitive to where stress syllable is. Even phrase formation is sensitive to stress. So sweet and sour doesn't really sound good to English speakers, where sour and sweet wouldn't sound good, but sweet and sour. What am I doing here? I have a start example for here, and I think I have it in the wrong way. Sweet and sour is better than sour and sweet in English. Okay, so please take that aspect out. Okay? For rhythmic reasons, this also depends on the stress position. Okay? We also know that stress position affects word segmentation, and even stress is recognized in orthography. Misspellings are more likely to be detected in a stressed syllable than in an unstressed syllable if the misspelled word was highly predictable from context. This is on the basis of recent research from 2016. So basically, English stress has arms and legs. It does things for other components of grammar. It helps you with spelling. It helps you with word segmentation. What about Turkish? Well, it's pretty sleepy. it doesn't really do much to you. So for that reason, there are, of course, you can say maybe there's no word level stress. So I can understand why people have reactions like that. Well, okay, it doesn't do anything. Evidence. Well, there's actually very limited contrastive function of stress in design. Very, very few minimal words. You could also say the same thing for English, by the way. There are also very few minimal pairs in English that is exclusively based on stress. Let's just ignore that. Stress doesn't interact with vowel harmony in Turkish, doesn't interact with any segmental processes. Like I tried to do this for so long, I couldn't find any relationship between any segmental processes in the language and stress. You don't use stress for any syntactic distinctions, except for the case of adverbial, which I think is interesting, so I leave that aside. Stress doesn't interact with word or phrase formation. There is no consistent pattern of the use of stress in Turkish poetry. I looked at this extensively. There are claims that historical varieties of Turkish use all types of verse that is available in other world literatures, in other world type of poetry, including the accentual verse, which relies on stress positions. But if you look at the evidence that authors present from 1960s, such as Mir Shan, it's actually, you can't really tell whether they're actually detecting the stress patterns there, the poets. We also have a recent project. We look at Turkish makam music. This is traditional Turkish music, whether prominences in music align with prominences in stress levels, which have been done actually for French recently. We don't really find very good interaction there, but this is an ongoing project. But what we have in Turkish is that Turkish stress must be good for something. What is it good for? Well, it's good for delimitation, demarcation of word positions. Now, we have to be cautious here. English was an extreme example. Russian is also a very important stress language. If you look at Russian, you'll find pretty much the same thing as in Turkish. The Russian stress also doesn't really interact with so many things. So we should be actually very careful when we compare a language with another language on the basis of these parameters. Okay? Now, returning to a study where we looked at this function that I mentioned, perhaps it's good for something. What could it be good for? As Koy said, well, perhaps insistence in stress systems, where the position of stress is fixed, you must be using that for some reason, like word segmentation. So, if you look at the figure in 7, what I have there is basically a language with initial stress. So if you have a string of syllables here, and you take prominence there in Finnish or in Hungarian, you would assume that there is a word boundary just before that syllable because in this language words have initial stress. Whereas in languages like Turkish and French, we assume that as soon as hearing some prominence with respect to F0, duration, or intensity, whatever that thing is, you would suggest the opposite. That is, you would progressively assign a word boundary to the right edge here. These are different systems, and they make different predictions on the basis of locational stress. So what we did in this study, where we use French and Turkish participants, we gave them a context. These were all nonsense syllables, and the target word, basically something with pavot. Okay, we asked the participants to respond with yes and no as soon as possible, whether the string here contained the target word pavot, for example, and that pavot had always had final stress. In some contexts, we had vowel harmony across the whole domain, and in some contexts, we had a mismatch in vowel harmony. We also tested the role of vowel harmony in this experiment. I'm going to ignore that for this purpose. But what is crucial is that we change the location of stress syllable in the context. It was either on the third syllable or the second syllable. Okay? And the assumption is that if it's on the third syllable, then it should be easier for people to recognize the target word. Okay? Not in the second syllable. And likewise, the same thing with this harmonic context. Stress is placed either on the third syllable or on the second syllable. Here are the results of this experiment. You find this beautifully actually represented. Both French is green, and Turkish participants respond very quickly to the target word if that target word occurs immediately after the stress syllable. So Turkish and French speakers both use stress as a cue for word segmentation. Okay? Turkish speakers also do this really, really fast. see that the bar is very small when there's a mismatch in the context. The vowel harmony also helps. It also helps with accuracy rates and reaction times. So there's a clear piece of evidence here that suggests that Turkish has Turkish and both Turkish and French make use of stress for word segmentation. For vowel harmony, in fact, it's only the Turkish speakers that turned out to be significantly using vowel harmony as a cue for word segmentation, not French speakers. There is a recent dissertation from Utrecht, Van Olmen, who replicated these findings, and she employed other languages, very similar experiments. She finds the same results, but what she has in her experiment is that she also varied the target word in her experiment. Exactly the same setup, but she used Dutch speakers. You can see that reaction times are faster if the target word has final stress. So people show more sensitivity for words with final stress as opposed to the words with initial stress. Okay? And you can see the role of context is very much like our experiment, that if the stress is positioned on the surface of the reaction times are fast as opposed to other languages that you see here in this case. Van Olmen actually continues on to another study where she looks at segmentation strategies. She presents participants, Dutch participants and Turkish participants, nonsense syllables, where stress is on different positions. The question is, how do you do the segmentation? So write out, type out the words that you hear. It's a very metalinguistic experiment, but it's quite informative. I'm not showing you the whole data here, but what you find is that Dutch segmentation strategies are very different from Turkish segmentation strategies, whereby you have a lot of different factors play a role here. Turkish participants don't necessarily give you monosyllabic words in this experiment, well, because Turkish words are longer. There are a lot of other constraints, but what you find is there's an overwhelming tendency that parsed words, segmented words have final stress. So they cut the cake such that the word that they produce for you, that they type out for you, have final stress. So all of these pieces of evidence suggest to me that there is actually word-level prominence in Turkish, and Turkish speakers make use of this extensively. Now, in section 8. I have 5 minutes, thank you. In section 8.2, what I'm showing you is that even the case of non-final stress is actually due to finality, final stress in Turkish. If you look at languages with edgemost stress, so Turkish has rightmost stress. There are other languages like that, for example, Basque and Mogul, they have rightmost stress. But in these languages, what they do at above the level of the phonological word is that if you have conflicting accents, the leftmost one will lead. So if in a case where you have two words that are fused together to form a compound, the leftmost word would have prominence, which is the case in Turkish, which is the case in Basque. What we suggested in our 2009 paper, Kabak and Viviado, we suggested that this actually conflicting directionality is very important in grammaticalization, in the phonologization of stress in Turkish and other languages. What you have in A there on page 14 is a very abstract representation of what is going on in a language like Basque or Turkish. These are languages where you have locally accented morphemes, like Eeyore in Turkish. Okay, you find the very same phenomenon in these languages, and these locally accented suffixes are always disyllabic. It's no surprise because actually they come from compositional constructions. So what you have here is actually like a compound construction where there's a word boundary. And what happens is that because they're used so frequently together, they fuse together. And because compound stress actually has leftmost prominence, the final stress of the leftmost member of the compound is promoted, and then you always get this prominence here stuck in the word, in the morpheme somewhere. But this is actually not due to any foot assignment or anything. It's actually purely due to word formation. Okay? What you're doing here is that you're assigning the regular final stress, but it gets stuck in the middle because the words get confused. Okay? And this is essentially how we explain the behavior of Eeyore in Turkish. There are other morphemes like Ider and Erek. They also come from compositional constructions where two words actually fuse together and the final stress ended up being stuck somewhere in the middle. Okay? So if you assume that Turkish has accentless words, you would not be able to actually explain this phenomenon. Let's move on to the cases of, so I'm fishing for evidence for word level stress, okay? So 8.3, in constructions, compounds, these are frequent collocations like tachikoptak or sasa, and what you find is this overwhelming tendency that the monosyllabic word appears as the first word and the disyllabic word appears as the second. If you change the order, you don't really get a very good combination. This has been attested in other languages, known as the Panini's law. Okay? Now, what I'm suggesting here is that this has to do with stress. Turkish doesn't want to have stress clash. If you reverse the situation, if you say toprak, tash, what you would have is that you would have final stress on toprak, and then tash is another lexical word, you would have a stress clash. And Turkish doesn't want stress clash, and therefore it changes the order. It does something like in English, where you have this iambic reversal process. 13, but you say 13, man, it's sort of a very similar situation, more like sweet and sour, sour and sweet kind of phenomenon. I've also struggled for years to explain why Turkish has this reduplication pattern that looks like a prefix. Turkish is overwhelmingly suffixing. Why do we have a prefixing strategy for emphasis? Well, it's also due to, I believe, it also falls from stress clash, such that if you're going to emphasize the reduplicative part in 11, and that would always be in a class situation if you actually attach the reduplicative to the final part of the word. Instead, Turkish prefers to attach to the beginning. This is a little preliminary, but I think this also falls from that. So, word level accentual properties determine the linear ordering of words, not sentence level prominence in the case of Turkish. In 8.4 and onwards, what I'm showing you is that you need to assume that Turkish has word level stress in order to account for compound stress patterns, because compound stress appears on the first word, but the final syllable of the first word. If you assume that Turkish words are accented, you wouldn't actually get that in a compound. Okay? And there is a phonetic study by Ipek in June, which is given to you in 8.4.2, where they show that actually within a clause, words that are not necessarily at the right edge of a phrase, they also have this X0 rise, which actually speaks for my claim that Turkish words have accentual prominence on their final syllable. And on the basis of these pieces of evidence, I would like to conclude, because the time is up already. Stress in Turkish, lexical or regular, has a psycholinguistic reality. I hope that I was able to convince you, although Turkish stress is very sleepy, like it doesn't need to be like English. It serves for some purpose, at least for word segmentation. It's a useful cue. And I've also shown you from examples like the co-compounds or compound stress. You have to assume that there is some word level prominence. What we shouldn't confuse, what we shouldn't do is probably we shouldn't confuse intonational level stress with word level stress. We have to treat them as separate entities. And I would just like to quote Hyman here, who says that intonation does not exist in a vacuum, rather it has a specific place in the overall design of grammar, one that makes it quite different from the tones and metrical structures which are present at the output of the lexical phonology and with which it may co-occur. And I would like to assume that the same thing applies to Turkish. There's word level prominence, there's word level stress, but there's also sentential stress. And sentential stress may certainly override word level stress, which is also the case in other languages like in Russian, maybe in Polish, the US, also in English. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for a really fascinating and informative talk. I'm afraid I'm going to ask just a small, nitpicky phonetics question about the examples in figure 3. So we have them on the handout on page 5. these F0 tracks, I was just wondering about what role declination might play in the analysis of these tracks, like the general tendency of pitch to drop towards the end of an utterance. If you are claiming, so if you're claiming that it's not rising at the end of an utterance, phonologically you might argue that staying flat at the end of an utterance would be equivalent to rising. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely, so what you actually recognize here is that you expect an S0 rise on the final syllable of the known layer, which is the object, but you don't see it. But what you see here is that the overall pitch is higher. So on the entire domain of the word is higher than the verb. And so there is some prominence that gets spread to the whole word. It's not, that doesn't appear on it. So there's some compensation for that. Actually, you can't completely rule that out, that S0 doesn't play a role. It does play a role, but there's not one particular syllable that shows that rise. The overall pitch level is higher.
Almost looks tonal in reference. It's a tonal.
Yeah, that's right. From where? From left to right. But as soon as you actually repeat that Did that answer your question?
Since you're on this side, I don't know Turkish. So, but you mentioned the subject, but it's accusative mark. I was a bit confused. So it doesn't look like.
It's I don't know. Yeah, it's actually. I'm sorry. It's not a subject. It's another object. Okay. So there are two objects.
Which
one
could
is
be
the
in
direct
fact
object. There's an indirect object.
Which could be, in fact, the edge at the edge of this domain, right?
So I mean, there could be a subject there as well, but Turkish is a subject drop language, and
He's dropped.
so basically, you have two major constituents of the clause. One is the indirect object followed by a direct object. What immediately precedes the verb is the one that receives nuclear stress. The other ones are prenuclear. So what you have there is that in a prenuclear position, you always have this final rise, no matter what that word is, lexically accented or not. There's a final rise, which Kamali assumes to be like a phrasal phenomenon. So it appears irrespective of what the word is. So I'm sorry, it's not the subject. So you're using
So thank you. This was very interesting. I'm not really a specialist in stress accent, but I know something about Slavic languages, and you compared the Turkish stress with Russian. So this is maybe not very a good example, because in Russian you have actually a lot of interaction of stress with from segmental level processes. You've got very strong vowel reduction processes. But if you take Polish, with Polish and regular stress pattern on the penultimate syllable, there is really no phonological processes that I can think of. This is a very lazy stress system, and the only thing that I can think of is really the delimiting function. That is, it certainly helps to chunk the words in perception, and otherwise I can't think of
There's
anything
nothing
else.
else, right? So I'm
So
so glad
maybe
that
this
you
is-
use the same
may-
words like laziness, right?
Yeah,
It's a
maybe
lazy
this-
system.
Maybe this is the language to compare. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it's all entirely clear, because I don't think that Polish speakers are stress deaf. So there might be still something else going on.
Well, they've actually shown, Peppercom and others have shown that Polish speakers are actually not stress deaf, despite the fact that language has regular stress. But probably it's due to variation. There must be some variation in the language. There must be words that are stressed on the initial syllable. So because of the variable position of stress, you may be sensitive to differences in stress position. Yeah. But I'm so glad that you brought up this example. Certainly Russian stress interacts with segmental phonology to the sense that unstressed vowels are reduced, but I'm citing Lavitskaya's dissertation. She doesn't really show, she actually considers nothing in the line. It's not a weight-sensitive system. Morphology interacts for sure because there are certain morphemes that come with certain stress configuration, but morphology doesn't demand anything from stress. So it sort of behaves like Turkish and Polish in that sense. And you wouldn't call Polish like pitch accent language,
Absolutely
right?
not. This is exactly my point. That, you could never claim anything else than saying the original stress systems.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Actual questions. Very interesting, Barış. So you've convinced us that we should take stress and Turkish more seriously, so it's a stress language. But then we're kind of left with the question of what would be a non-stress language. So maybe all of the others who have been claimed, if we go that deep and look at these particular psycholinguistic issues, then we come up with the same answer. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's theoretical work, there's experimental work that sometimes, they don't confirm each other. So like for Korean, you find theoretical studies that claim metrical stress for that language. But if you ask a native speaker of Korean, they say, there's no stress in this language, right? So what is a stressless language? Maybe they don't exist. Well, I mean, if you look at Hyman, he actually strongly argues that there's no such thing as pitch accent language. Pitch accent languages are tone languages that have very limited tonal inventory. Just a two level contrast tone language. So it's very difficult to actually find direct pieces of evidence to suggest that a particular language behaves like pitch accent. The only reliable cue that they use is F0. The language predominantly uses F0, but you can say the same thing actually about English. Only in certain contexts, actually F0 also disappears in English in certain particular sentential contexts. So if you can control for the sentential context, if you're measuring each of these components. And I don't think that there is a direct link between phonetics to phonology. Phonology is more of the abstract level for me. Phonology is phonetics in the memory. You have to look at the whole system and see what stress does or what pitch accent does in the system. And this is what I'm trying to do, and it's very, very difficult. I'm trying to do experimental phonology, and you find sometimes very surprising results. You don't even know what to do.
We have time for one more question.
This is maybe a silly question, it's very specific, but in the Göksel and Kurs-like grammar of Turkish and other grammars, and in this the handout too, I noticed that it always says that the "ior" suffix is stressed on the initial vowel, but I've talked with other learners of Turkish of it as a second language, and we always unfailingly perceive that as the stress being on the O. Is there an easy explanation for why?
Well, the easy explanation is that they go with the most regular pattern. So there's regularization in Turkish. I completely agree with you. And Kornfield actually mentions this in her grammar, Turkish grammar, that "ior" is variable. Probably this has to do with register that, I also have that sometimes. I have it on final syllable, sometimes on the initial syllable. It varies. But I mean, it may. I mean, Öner actually worked on this. You looked at variation. It's sensitive to information structure. It's sensitive to the position of stress. So and I think also there's this case of regularization in language. In this experiment, the behavioral part of the experiment shows you that if you have like teatro, if you produce that the final step teatro, people don't seem to notice that the word is pronounced differently. But this only happens if a word with penultimate stress is deviantly produced with finals, not the other way around. That shows me that there's some sort of regularization frequency effect, because an overwhelming number of words in Turkish have that. So if the language is going to change, if the stress position is going to change, then I would expect that it would actually be more right aligned than left aligned. So
So when I say video, I might not actually sound that bad.
Yeah, maybe Öner has an explanation as to when you have these contacts.
Yeah, my explanation would take too much time right now, but I assume underlying foot edges. So for ear, it is not fully footed, but only the second syllable is footed. So it basically has variable stress on the surface, especially if you put a pre-stressing suffix right after. So a Turkish speaker will tend to say geliyor instead of geliyor. But if you put a pre-stressing suffix like mu, then many people will also say geliyor mu instead of geliyor mu. Despite the fact that normally, as Barış mentioned, when you have two exceptional suffixes, normally the leftmost one is more prominent. But in this case, because of that behavior of your, sometimes you have some variation on the surface.
You look so tall.